David. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking about the Ricoh FF-9S. The FF-9S was introduced in 1990. It's the follow-up to the FF-9, which was also called the FF-7 in some markets, which was also called the Shotmaster AF, I guess, somewhere. Anyway, it's a very similar camera to the FF-9 to the point where I would say you can take all the information from this review and assume it mostly applies to the FF-9. Most of what it seems is different is that the body shell got a bit of a redesign, but they're both pretty much the same camera as I understand. There might be some differences there. As you can see, it's a pretty small camera. It's I would say pocketable, if a bit fat, but if you have big enough pockets, it can certainly fit in there. And it's a very easy thing to slip into a camera bag as just a backup camera, or just having your waist bag or something like that. The Ricoh FF-9S is a pretty light camera with 35mm f3.5 lens. Unfortunately, the limits of compact optical design kind of express themselves in the close focus being 0.8 meters, which is not ideal. I think in using this camera, I found myself wanting to get closer, but it just wouldn't focus. It does have a focus confirmation light that will tell you if you're too close, and it's pretty accurate. And I think when you use this camera, you'll quite often find that you're just getting closer to the subject than the camera can focus, which is a bit of a downside. It has a very easy to use focus lock at the hat press. And we have shutter speeds between 1/4 of a second and 1/400th of a second. This is a very good and useful range. And we should be able to get a good amount of ambient light at nighttime at 1/4 of a second. And with a lens of f3.5. The metering is going to be center weighted. So it's going to prioritize the exposure towards the middle of the frame, but it does consider it is affected by exposure on the periphery of the frame. So in practice, you can very easily lock your exposure on a particular point in the environment, and then move to frame your picture. This is a DX code reading camera with film speeds from 100 to 1600. If your film canister does not have a DX code on it, it will default to 100. This has a motor drive, of course, and you'll find that when rewinding the roll, it will leave the leader out of the film can, which is something some people like. Decently powerful and useful flash, but don't expect too much. It uses the CRP2 cells, which are easy enough to find, perhaps a little more expensive these days. And again, the modes are landscape, night, continuous, multiple exposure, and interval. This camera is turned on by opening the lens cover, and that reveals the 35mm f3.5 lens. Really pretty typical for an internal lens compact like this, f3.5. And there are certainly plenty of good 35mm f3.5 lenses floating around in compact cameras by now. The shutter button is a nice size, big, hard one, and it has a pretty good half press on it. You might accidentally full press sometimes. It's maybe a little sensitive, but it's a pretty good shutter button. This camera does have exposure lock and focus lock when you half press the shutter. And so when you half press the shutter as well, if it thinks it needs to use the flash, it's going to pop the flash up like so. I mean, I for one particularly like this flash mechanism. It's just kind of cool. There is no setting for turning the flash off, so if you don't want flash, then you got to hold the flash down, which makes it, of course, a two-hand operation there, and it will, of course, meter accordingly. If you hold the flash down, it will meter, for no flash. At the top here, we have the self timer button, which gives you a 10-second stealth timer, and on the side is where we change our modes. The button is recessed, so it probably won't be accidentally pressed, but it's also it's a bit annoying to try to press, especially as there are several modes to cycle through. So the modes we have here are upside down. The first one, the mountains, is panorama mode, which I believe is just infinity focus. It's not what you would think you would call a panorama, but okay. That just focuses at infinity and doesn't allow flash. The next mode is night mode, and that will get you the slowest shutter speed, and probably open up the lens wide so you can get as much ambient light as possible. TV mode will, I believe, set the shutter speed to a 30th of a second so you can photograph this screen without flicker. And continuous. It has continuous mode, which is not very fast, as you might expect. So that's that. And there's an interval mode, which shoots at 60-second intervals, I guess. I'm assuming. I haven't tried it. And then lastly, all the way at the end is multi-exposure mode, which is kind of one of the things I tend to do and tend to look for in cameras, is having a multi-exposure mode. And this has it. The facility works a little different from other cameras. First I'll say, having to cycle through all those modes, how many presses, 6 button presses, is not great. That kind of sucks, especially with the buttons not super easy to press. That said, it's kind of a different implementation of a multi-exposure mode, because you just keep the camera on. So after you take a frame in multi-exposure mode, you can make unlimited exposures on the same frame. Now, when it cycles is when you turn off the camera, or when you close it. So, if you're like me, and you like to do multi-exposures, but you kind of like look around, shop around for imagery to put together, and so your exposures might be hours or days or weeks apart on any given frame. This means you kind of need to keep the camera on, which sounds like it might be a problem, but actually it's not. When it's on like this, it's open, it actually seems like it doesn't really use much battery power. I've run quite a few rolls through this in the past few months over the summer, and I haven't had to change the battery out. It's and you know, this is sometimes keeping it on for several days hasn't been a problem. It seems to just have it's a kind of standby mode, and you know, it's a very seems like a very power efficient camera. It doesn't really burn through your battery. And I'll say too about the flash recycles very quickly. I believe the recycle time is about 2 seconds on the flash, which is really fast for a 35mm point and shoot. Like that's pretty great. So yeah, already a very modern camera in terms of, like, you know, the power and flash and whatnot. But yeah, that's what you have to do with the multi-exposure mode, so that's a little different, and you know, you just have to be mindful of that. But it's very flexible because you can just do unlimited frames, which is cool. And the top, you know, you have your battery indicator and stuff like that. Again, like I haven't changed the battery once and it's still full, so not bad. At the back, you know, typical stuff. Autofocus indicator. It's very snappy, and you got a flash indicator. Pretty basic, pretty standard. This is not a super complicated camera. And the viewfinder is not huge, but a decent size. It's an adequate size. I like the viewfinder well enough on this. And if you notice, I have a few dings on this camera. I haven't dropped it a couple of times, unfortunately, but fortunately, I do believe this is a pretty well-built camera. I haven't had any problems with it, besides the shell popping out a bit here and there. But these are, seems like a very well-designed camera, and not one that's going to be prone to failure. Overall, the frame looks good here. There's not noticeable distortion, and from afar it looks pretty sharp. When we zoom in the center, we can see there's pretty good fine detail on this stone, and on the windows is perhaps a little smudginess with the window shot, as that was probably shot at max aperture, but it's still well resolved and has a good amount of detail. And if we move to the periphery, it looks pretty good. I can find a little smudginess in this corner here, but otherwise I think it looks good across the frame. In the next picture, we can see again in the center pretty nice resolution, and this is a pretty low light shot. The negative quality is not that great, but we still get decent picture quality out of it. We can see there what the out of focus elements are going to look like. Not distracting, pretty much what you would expect. And again, it looks pretty good across the frame. We're seeing fine detail at the edges of the frame, and no fall off that's really detectable. Although that's going to be much less apparent in these multi-exposure photos. You're not going to notice the vignetting so much. And a camera like this, I would pretty much expect there to be some noticeable vignetting, although I think on this camera it's not that bad. We have really excellent fine detail in the center, and again, like the other pictures, there's some really intricate texture here that this lens is handling really well. Aside from that, we noticed that in all these pictures it's getting the focus pretty well. And these weren't like, I didn't take a lot of frames with these, you know, like they were mostly just kind of one shots. And it's hitting the focus. And again, this is like, it's not the most elaborate focusing system. You know, there's just a few focusing zones. It's not a crazy complicated camera, but it's just like simple and works. And we see mostly out of focus areas on the edge of frame, but you know, they look well handled. I'm not seeing crazy distortion or field curvature, stuff like that. So this is a lens that can produce some pretty nice printable negatives for you. Another thing about this camera is that it has a useful shutter speed range, which is such a buzzkill for so many compact cameras, where they'll have a minimum shutter speed of like 50th of a second or something like that, and it's just not useful. But a quarter of a second is genuinely a useful slow shutter speed, and 1/400th of a second is also a useful fast shutter speed. So I think that's really about as good as you can expect from any compact camera. So that gets my my seal of approval on that. You know, that alone makes it a very useful compact camera. Overall, it's a really satisfying camera to use. It is the kind of the essence of what a compact point and shoot camera should be. It is truly compact, and it's super simple to use. There's not a lot of you don't have to think about much besides focusing and framing, and it does those really well. So this is something I would recommend that you pick up. This or the FF7 or FF9, whatever. They're Ricoh banged out some good ones back in the day. I feel like they had something special about their autofocus systems that they just worked, and they had some good optics they were putting into these little cameras. These, I think you can get them for pretty cheap. Definitely pick it up. It's one that kind of staying around in my collection, even as I shoot less film. I found it immensely useful, and it's pretty cool. Well, that's all for today. If you watched, thanks for watching, and don't forget, like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram at laser spelled with Z. Peace.